The cold cuts deeper than you expect. It's not just the draft slipping through the cracks of the palace walls, it's the stairs. They follow you everywhere. Eyes that don't quite see a person, just the shape you've become. The weight on your chest isn't from the tight-laced gown they forced you into this morning, though that doesn't help. It's the knowledge, sharp as winter air, that you were brought here not to be seen, but to be laughed at. Brihuega, 1674. The village tucked into the Castilian hills had weathered droughts and plagues, but nothing quite prepared them for the whispers that began the summer Eugenia Martínez Vallejo was born. From her first breath, she was different. Her hunger was relentless, her growth alarming. By her first birthday, neighbors crossed themselves when she passed. By 6, she could barely walk without gasping, her body swelling beyond anything the village physician had ever documented. The priest called her a theological puzzle. The children called her La Monstra, the monster. And before we go any deeper into what happened to this child, I have to pause and say, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Because honestly, the fact that Eugenia's story is reaching people across continents right now, centuries after she lived, still takes my breath away. What the villagers didn't know, couldn't have known, was that their whispers would reach the Alcazar Palace in Madrid, where King Charles II sat on a throne, built from curiosity and cruelty in equal measure. The Spanish court of the 1680s had an insatiable appetite for marvels, dwarfs, giants, the deformed, the extraordinary. When word reached the king of a peasant girl whose body defied nature, he did what absolute monarchs do. He summoned her. The letter arrived on a scorching day in 1680, delivered by a horseman whose livery bore the royal crest. Eugenia was 6 years old. Her father, Tomás, a farmer whose hands were more familiar with rocky soil than royal commands, took the parchment with trembling fingers. The village scribe read it aloud. By order of His Most Catholic Majesty, the child Eugenia Martínez Vallejo is summoned to Madrid to be presented before the nobility. Maria, Eugenia's mother, clutched her daughter and whispered a single word. No. But the horseman's face was stone. The king's will is not to be questioned. The child is a wonder. 2 days later, they dressed Eugenia in hastily stitched wool dyed a faded blue, the finest the village seamstress could manage. Tomás pressed a wooden cross into her small palm. God goes with you, he said, though his voice cracked with doubt. The carriage that carried her away had velvet curtains drawn tight, not for her comfort but to preserve the surprise. Don Alvaro, the royal escort, made that clear. You are to be presented as a curiosity, not a squalling peasant. The journey to Madrid took 5 days. At night they hid her in inn backrooms. Once Eugenia overheard 2 maids outside her door. They say she weighs as much as an ox. Poor creature. Do you think she knows what they'll do to her? Eugenia did not sleep that night, or the next. When the palace spires finally rose against the sky, her stomach turned. Madrid was nothing like Brihuega. It roared with noise, reeked of waste and perfume, and the palace itself seemed built to swallow people whole. Guards in polished breastplates watched as her carriage rolled through golden gates into a courtyard where courtiers in silk paused mid-conversation, their eyes locking onto her with something between fascination and hunger. A man in a powdered wig leaned toward his companion. So this is the monstrous child, how delightfully grotesque. The grand hall of the Alcazar glittered with candlelight. Eugenia stood at its center, barefoot on plush carpet, surrounded by a semicircle of Spanish nobility. Their silks rustled, their fans fluttered. And at the far end, beneath crimson velvet, sat King Charles II, pale, sickly, his jaw jutting in the distinctive Habsburg way. His dull eyes gleamed as he gestured. Bring her forth. Don Alvaro nudged her with his boot. She stumbled. Laughter rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. Turn, the king commanded. When she hesitated, Don Alvaro seized her shoulder and spun her roughly. The nobles gasped with theatrical delight. Marvelous, a bishop in embroidered robes said, clapping. Such abundance must be divine favor, or divine jest. A duchess called out, Can she dance? Before Eugenia could process the question, a fiddler struck up a tune. The nobles clapped in rhythm, their smiles sharp as knives. "Go on, peasant, show us how you celebrate." Eugenia's legs moved, not by choice but by survival instinct. She swayed awkwardly, arms flailing to keep balance. Someone threw a sugared almond. It struck her cheek and the laughter crescendoed into something monstrous. "Enough," Queen Mariana said quietly, but Charles II waved dismissively. "The girl amuses me. Have her fed. I wish to see how much she consumes." They brought a table laden with roasted meats, sweetmeats, flagons of wine. The court pressed closer, eyes alight. The king leaned forward. "Eat." At home, hunger had been Eugenia's constant shadow. But here, surrounded by jeweled hands and painted faces, food became weaponized. Each bite she took earned applause. Each swallow prompted fresh jeers. "Like a pig at trough," someone shouted. When the platters emptied, Charles yawned. "Take her away. We'll have her again tomorrow." Tomorrow came. And the day after. And the day after that. The performances became routine and brutal. They dressed her in armor too small and called her the Great Fat Knight, poking her with canes. They had her balance on stools while jesters pretended to knock her off. On the Feast of St. John, they filled a drained fountain with wine and made her climb in while the court cheered, "Drink, let's see if she floats." But the cruelest performance came when Don Sebastian de Herrera, court painter, set up his easel in the portrait gallery. "You will sit as I command," he said, his voice sharp with disdain. Eugenia climbed onto a raised platform draped in brocade. The painter circled her like a predator. "Turn your face to the light. No, chin up. Let them see the fullness of your abundance." The nobles gathered to watch, whispering behind gloves. Will he paint her as she is, or as she feels? As she is would be horror enough. Don Sebastian worked for hours, his brush scraping canvas with ruthless precision. He exaggerated every fold, every curve, until Eugenia resembled less a human child and more a grotesque monument to excess. When he finally turned the canvas toward the court, they gasped in delighted horror. "Exquisite," the king murmured, "a true masterpiece of the bizarre." Eugenia caught a glimpse as they led her away. There she was, immortalized not as a girl but as a punchline. Her body ballooned impossibly on canvas, her face hollow, eyes dark with suffering that the painter had captured with disturbing accuracy. That night, locked in her cell, Eugenia wept into straw that reeked of mildew. The cross her father had given her was gone, lost somewhere in the chaos of performance. But something else was born that night. Something small and sharp. The next morning, when servants brought her breakfast, a platter piled obscenely high, Eugenia did not touch it. She let it sit until the bread went stale. The servant frowned. "You didn't eat." Eugenia said nothing. When it happened again the next day, the servant's frown deepened. By the third day, the portions grew larger, richer, as if to tempt her into submission. Still, Eugenia turned away. "The king won't be pleased," the servant warned. Eugenia met his gaze, truly met it for the first time since arriving. "Let him be displeased." The words were quiet, but they cracked something open in the room. The servant's eyes widened as if he'd never considered the monster might have a will. When Don Sebastian summoned her for another sitting, this time alongside a dwarf and bearded lady, a grotesque triptych of nature's marvels, Eugenia refused to climb the platform. "I will not sit for you." The painter's face darkened. "You will, or the king will hear of it. Then let him hear." The nobles gasped. No one denied the king. Don Sebastian's hand moved toward his belt where a thin switch hung. But when he looked into Eugenia's eyes, something made him hesitate. He lowered the switch. "This defiance will cost you." It did. Her meals were reduced to crusts and water. During a royal procession, when the king commanded her to kiss the ground in gratitude, she instead plucked a wildflower from the grass and let it fall, petals scattering in the breeze. The guards seized her, but she did not struggle. That night, pressed against the door of her locked chamber, she heard them muttering outside. Even a beast knows when it's been pushed too far. Eugenia smiled in the darkness. The rebellion was small, silent, but it was hers. Years passed. The court's fascination withered like fruit left in the sun. New marvels arrived, a fire eater from the Orient, conjoined twins who sang in harmony. Eugenia was moved to the servants' quarters, given shapeless shifts instead of silk. The feasts stopped. Her body, once grotesquely large, began to shrink, not from health, but from neglect. No one came to see her anymore, except the rats. And once, briefly, a young scullery maid who brought stolen cheese and asked in a whisper, "Did you really dance for the king?" "I did." "Was it grand?" Eugenia's laugh was bitter. No, it was not grand. The girl kept returning with scraps and stories until one day she didn't. Life went on, without Eugenia. In the Hall of Curiosities, her portrait gathered dust in a dark corner, forgotten behind newer attractions. Visitors barely glanced at the bloated figure with hollow eyes. Winter came sharp and biting. Eugenia coughed often now, a wet rattle that echoed off stone. No physician came. On the coldest night, when wind howled through the cracks like grieving spirits, a painter appeared at her door. Not Don Sebastian, but a younger man named Luis. "I've been sent to paint you," he said. Eugenia didn't move from her cot. Why? The king's command. Of course. Even in her fading, she was still a spectacle. Luis worked quietly, without cruelty. When Eugenia asked his name, he answered simply. When she asked if he painted many monsters, he replied, "I paint people." The words settled over her like mercy. When the light faded, he set down his brush. "It's done." Before leaving, he paused. "They will remember you." Eugenia turned her face to the wall. "No, they will remember the monster they made of me." Days later, she died. A servant found her body, crossed himself, and fetched the gravedigger. "Who was she?" the gravedigger asked. The servant shrugged. "No one important. She was buried in an unmarked grave." The court moved on. The world did not pause. But the portrait outlived her. It hung for decades, then centuries, changing hands among collectors who saw it as a curiosity, not a chronicle of cruelty. Art historians praised the masterful distortion. No one spoke of the girl beneath the paint. Until centuries later, a young artist stumbled upon it in a forgotten museum corner. Something in those painted eyes, dark, wounded but defiant, held her captive. She returned day after day, sketching Eugenia's face, trying to capture what the original painter had missed, the person behind the spectacle. In Madrid, a poet took a stage and her voice trembled. They called her monster, but who carved that word into her skin? And in Brihuega, where wind still carries old whispers, a weathered plaque was installed, half hidden by ivy. Eugenia Martínez Vallejo, 1674-1690. She was a child. The legacy of a monster is not written by those who gawked. It's written in the quiet acts of remembrance, the artist who sees humanity, the poet who gives voice, the village that reclaims a name, Eugenia Martínez. Vallejo was never the monster. The monsters were the ones who made her one, and they wore crowns, held brushes, and called it entertainment. History recorded their laughter. But if you listen closely, past the archives, past the canvas, you can still hear her silence, and it speaks louder than they ever did.